And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee. Please join me and my guests on this next interview. A dispute has erupted between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant over the terms of a potential ceasefire and hostage deal in Gaza. Meanwhile, the Israeli military has recovered the bodies of 6 hostages, including American-Israeli Hersh Goldberg-Polin, in a tunnel beneath Rafah, intensifying the already tense situation. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss these developments is Patrick Hilsman, a columnist. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first, can you help us understand how the dispute between Netanyahu and Gallant might impact the broader conflict in Gaza?
Well, the dispute between the military and the government can be characterized by the fact that it's clear that we're hearing leaks that there's a lot of dispute between the military and the civilian government on the issue of hostage negotiations. So there have been several leaks recently that indicate that Netanyahu has been scuttling negotiations over small issues at the same time that Hamas has rejected ceasefire terms. So there's a political climate in Israel right now that sees Netanyahu as being kind of the cause of the hostage negotiations falling through. And with the deaths that occurred over the past few days, it's obviously going to intensify.
Right, like you mentioned, there is sort of a kind of a political narrative inside Israel that puts the blame on the shoulders of Netanyahu. We do know that the family of the hostage, one of the hostages has been killed, is actually a very strong advocate for coming to a ceasefire deal. Do you think that, well, the passing of these hostages and their family, they would put the blame more on Hamas, or are they going to see Netanyahu as the reason for the passing of these hostages?
I think they will rightly see both to blame. The clear, obvious culprit is Hamas. And though the Israeli military is not a reliable source of information for everything, there are clear cases when they have completely lied about the harm that they've done to Palestinians, to mass killings. Mass graves have been discovered. There are a lot of things that the Israeli military said that are not reliable. But when it comes to the accounting of how the hostages were found, they have to account to their own citizens and the hostages' families. So all evidence points to Hamas having killed these people completely in cold blood, unlike some of the hostages that have been killed in crossfire between the Israelis and Hamas, or that were killed in cold blood by the Israeli military because they thought that they were Palestinians. In this case, Hamas seems to have just shot these people, killed them in cold blood. So there's no doubt who is to blame. But we've all known what would happen. The hostages' families knew what would happen if a ceasefire deal was rejected and if Israel chose a military solution to try and fight their way to the hostages. It was known that people would die. So I imagine that the hostages' families blame Netanyahu and Hamas, obviously, who is the main culprit.
And what do you think of this disagreement with over the corridor, or like you said, a lot of rift between the Netanyahu and the military is going to have when it comes to these ceasefire and hostage negotiation? Is this like an attempt to stall any sort of negotiation, or do they have like an end game in mind?
In terms of an end game, it seems like it's a dispute over the specifics of where they want the military to be deployed according to a ceasefire deal. There's the area is important because it acts as a buffer zone with Egypt. The Israelis consider it militarily important for that purpose. But I mean, these are all small countries that are going to have to negotiate for peace. So the idea that a small strip of land would protect Israel from a political conflict doesn't really make sense. It seems that the conflict itself has to be ended.
Right, so there is a little bit of splitting hairs there, it does seem. Do you think the recovery of American-Israeli citizen is also going to impact how the United States approach this conflict?
I don't think it's going to change the approach to the conflict. I think the fact that an American citizen hostage died is all the more reason to support negotiations. And I hope that the Americans will stop selling these offensive weapons to Israel and stop giving these offensive weapons to Israel, because it's just a fact that dropping a bunch of bombs in the area is going to kill civilians and potentially also kill the remaining hostages. So I think if the United States is to take something from this, it should be to support negotiation. But of course, I don't think that the death of one person, sadly, is going to influence American policy much one way or another, because we've seen at least 40,000 people killed in Gaza, and it hasn't really changed the weapons that America is willing to deliver to Israel.
Right. Do you think that's going to have like this purposed incentive structure in which a hostage was killed and then which resulting in America putting more pressure on the Israeli side? Do you think there's a possibility that Hamas will be further emboldened to take actions on more hostage, seeing that this might give them the result they want to see?
I think that I think that Hamas and Israel are both fighting in kind of an apocalyptic way right now, and I don't think that we can really predict how Hamas is going to behave in a situation where they're cornered and where there's a genocide happening to people who are not affiliated with Hamas at the same time. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine their posture changing much.
Right, and Biden has also came out and say that the Hamas will have to answer for their crimes. Do you think there's anything concrete he meant when he says that, or do you think it's mostly a message, a signal?
I think it's mostly a signal to a domestic audience that's understandably very upset about an American citizen being killed. But of course, I have to say that there have also been American citizens killed by the Israelis in Palestine.
Yeah, very much so. And I think this is going to be like further exacerbate the debate that's going on in the Middle East. Do you think this will change any perception for the U.S. citizens when it comes to this conflict? Or do you think it's just going to drive the rift and the divide even further?
I think it just goes to serve that we're dealing with ruthless actors on all sides. One actor has ruthlessly kidnapped a couple hundred Israeli civilians who are completely innocent of this conflict. And the other actor is engaged in a genocide, which so far has not released the hostages, has killed several of them, and has resulted in at least 40,000 deaths in Gaza.
Right, and do you think the information of American citizen being involved, the way it's being covered right now, may change or, well, at least have some American thinking about switching their position and stance when it comes to this discussion?
I think that all the severity of the loss of life and the tragedies that we're seeing right now should be a motivation to try and support a ceasefire. I think that the American public hopefully will see this as a tragedy that could have been avoided, and that maybe we can use this as a lesson to not blindly trust our allies when they try to take military solutions that we know will kill a lot of civilians. This is especially sad to see because everybody could have told you that this would happen. I came on TVP about a year ago and I said the problem with a military solution is that if you go in with the full forces in the army, they're going to eventually kill the hostages. And we're about a year later and the Israeli military has killed several hostages. Now we know as a fact that Hamas has killed several hostages and 4 have been released by military force, and the rest who are alive are because of a deal. So a logical conclusion would be that the only way to get the rest out is through a deal.
All right, it does seem like violence begins more violence, and this unfortunately is the situation we're seeing right now. So last but not least, you did mention that eventually a deal needs to be reached. Do you think there's any sort of compromise or goodwill on each side's part to actually reach a ceasefire, or are they still on this path of what you would just describe as a apocalyptic way of fighting?
I think that kind of a bloody status quo has been reached in the Gaza Strip to a certain degree because it's understood that there have been leaks from the Israeli government saying that Netanyahu doesn't care if the hostages live or die. That could be, a more extreme characterization of his position, but he's sure acting like he doesn't care if they live or die because a lot of them are indeed dead. And so who knows how long they can survive this, but what is going on right now is not some brilliant plan to bring them home alive. It's a genocide on the backs of this horrible tragedy of kidnapping. And what we've seen are not results that are positive. The Palestinians in Gaza knew that this would be a bloody disaster. The Israeli hostages' families know that this is a bloody disaster. There's no justifying it all around. It has to stop.
Right, I think this is also reflected by the fact that overnight there's another large-scale protest in Israel, which has to be kind of put down with the involvement of the police. Do you think this will actually have any effect in pushing the government to take a different stance, or is it going to fall on deaf ears like so much of the other protests that has taken place prior to this?
I think that the deaths of Israelis needlessly is something that does move the Israeli public. There have been several other hostage situations in Israel, obviously, and hostages' families are very important in public discourse in Israel. So I imagine that the hostages' families will probably continue to call for a ceasefire, and hopefully they will win, and there'll be a ceasefire, and these people will come home, and this genocide will stop.
All right, so let's keep our fingers crossed that peace comes sooner rather than later. In the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Our guest has been Patrick Hilsman, columnist. Thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thanks so much.
Cheers. And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.